And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
It's not that America, the United States, was going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable, serious talk.
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
So if you don't mind...
Okay, so is Putin just going to manhandle him? Is this going to be the whole... Is this going to be Putin manhandling him? Is that what's going to happen? Okay. You're ready.
And I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Let's look where our relation...
By the way, whether or not Putin wants to discredit that, if you watch Russian state media, the media that he funds, there is constantly the idea pushed to the Russian public that they have to invade Ukraine in large part, not only because, you know, the Ukrainians are not real and the Eastern Ukraine actually belongs to Russia because they used to own it during an empire, you know, that they used to have but no longer have, and the people there don't want them back. But sorry, I'm a little taken aback right now. What did he really just manhandle Tucker and his thing was just laugh in response?
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Let's look where our relationship with Ukraine started from. Where did Ukraine come from? The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized state.
But yeah, no, in Russian state media, they constantly talk about America possibly invading or NATO invading, NATO super soldiers already being deployed in Ukraine. I remember during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Russian state media said that the reason it succeeded wasn't because of the Ukrainians and their ingenuity or, well, good planning or any of that. It was because there were NATO soldiers on the ground, and they proved it by showing like a black guy that was there. That was the proof. And there's constant talk about they need to be able to hold this here, because if not, then they'll use it as a launching pad to attack Russia. So whether or not Putin himself has said it, and it sounds like Tucker was about to pull a quote before he was shut down by Putin, Russian state media, Russian politicians, the Russian government has certainly pumped that out regularly to their public. Now, what they pump out to the American public and to the international space through English Russia Today is very different than what they push to the domestic audience. But yes, domestically they do push that.
Statehood. And it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862.
No, it was not the Russian, whatever. It was the Kievan Rus. The Russian state as we know it today did not exist then. Did not. Just didn't. You could say that the entities that existed then would eventually grow and change, and after revolutions and different administrations would eventually turn into Russia today, after transition to here, revolution there, overthrow here, but it's not the same. Because if we're using this logic, then not only would Putin have the rights to Eastern Ukraine if we end up using this logic, like, well, there was an empire 500 years ago, or, well, there was an empire 200 years ago, then wouldn't this logic also apply to multiple NATO states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? If we were to take its logic to its logical conclusion,
Townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign.
If you want a good book on Ukrainian history, I actually have one right. This is the book I would recommend for anybody who wants to have a basic overview of Ukrainian history. For those of you who are not interested in regurgitating these talking points, it's called Ukraine, the Forging of a Nation. It's by a really good Ukrainian historian, Yaroslav. I recommend it.
In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood. And in Novgorod, there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country. In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, who was actually playing the role of regent at Rurik's younger son,
по сути, функция регента
because Rurik had died by that time, came to Kiev.
к этому времени.
Okay, this is all going to get very boring very quick, and this is part of the reason why you would think Putin interviews would be more interesting, but they're not, is because Putin's actually a massive nerd. And his main activity is trying to justify, well, Russia owns this, and Russia owns that, and Russia owns this, because it owned it 300 years ago. I don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time like going into all the history that he's explaining. I'll just let him go off. But let me just throw this out here. Again, I've offered a counter resource. A lot of the things I'm going to say probably disagreed with by Ukrainian historians, other historians, most historians. I remember the funniest was when he got a historian to bring him an old map, and then the historian pointed to the map and said, "There's no Ukraine here, hundreds of years old. Isn't that interesting?" And Putin was like, "Oh, yes, haha." But if you looked at the map, Ukraine actually was on the map. They just point at it and pretended it wasn't there. I don't know. It's like a lot of it's silly. You can go look at those old moments if you want to laugh at Putin. But even if everything he was saying is true, we're Americans. The idea that, well, we used to be part of this empire, therefore we're forever part of this empire, is very, very silly to us. If the Ukrainian people want to be free, or that their culture and identity has evolved to the point where they don't want to be ruled by Moscow anymore, whether or not they owned it 300, 200, or even 100 years ago, does not matter that much to me, and it doesn't seem to be something that the people who actually live there care that much about.
A very significant date in the history of Russia was 988.
Vladimir,
This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity.
централизованное российское государство.
From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen.
Единая территория.
Why?
Единая
Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties,
один язык.
one and the same language, and
Can I also throw out there that around this time period, you know, Ukraine was also owned by other empires like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There is a Hungarian community in Ukraine for a reason. There are people in Ukraine that were in Ukraine that also used to be Polish, or a lot of violence. There's still some, but violence. I mean, there was other empires that owned it. Does Polish have the same rights to Ukraine as the Russians do?
after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule of the prince. The centralized Russian state began to take shape.
Российское государство.
Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to a throne.
I'm sorry, man. I'm imagining, like, there's, like, a family, like, shivering in a corner and, like, a Wagner soldier breathing heavy, like, he just took their home. They're going to use it for a base. They took out one of the books on the shelf, and it was Ukrainian nationalist propaganda. And they're all huddled in the corner, not knowing what he's going to do. And then he's like, do you know why you're wrong? And like, why are we wrong about wanting to be free? Well, back in the 9th century, Yaroslav the Wise, I'm just sorry, it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's silly. You don't need to go back to the 9th century to explain the elements of this war. To me, it feels like those people who throw a bunch of Latin words in their sentences to make themselves sound smarter. Like he's going back in history just to prove that he's read a book once or twice. And he's trying to manipulate that historical knowledge, that historiography, to try to strengthen his nationalist message, which nation states do all the time, creating their own national stories that are always more important than other nations' national stories. You ever notice that? The Ukrainian national story is so much less important than the Russian national story. Why? Well, because the Russians are bigger. Therefore, their story is louder.